tell me you're no good. I'm brushing the weight of you of my shoulders. Done with my cigarette, and when all the smoke is clear, I'm brushing the weight of you, the weight of you, the weight of you. Don't need an old man. Tell me you're no good. I'm brushing the weight of you, the weight of you, of my shoulders. Done with my cigarette, and when all the smoke is clear, I'm brushing the weight of you, the weight of you, the weight of you. Don't need an old man.
Broken glass while I'm thinking in my head. I mind my own, I don't even break a sweat. Oh, this madness is insane. Why you still live in vain? I'm not the one, you're the victim of your own mistakes. It's time to hit the lights, under the street lights, under the street lights. Untold stories, they were left behind. Silent breeze, I got nothing on my mind. This madness is insane. Why you still live in vain? I'm not the one, you're the victim of your own mistakes. It's time to hit the lights, under the street lights, under the street lights.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Getting Weaned Pigs Off to a Great Start, made possible by Tonisity and Swine. My name is Dr. Clayton Johnson, and I'm the Director of Veterinary Services for Carthage Veterinary Service, and I get to be your host today. Thanks so much for being with us here. On today's webinar, Getting Weaned Pigs Off to a Great Start, we're going to discuss this critical moment in time of pig production while highlighting practical strategies to optimize our weaned pig performance. I just came off attending our annual meeting of the American Association of Swine Veterinarians. And I can tell you there's a lot of talk in the audience about the fact that we are in a period with $100 weaned pigs. Weaned pigs are being sold for $100. Just a couple of short years after they were being sold for a tiny fraction of that, literally $1, $2. Now, that's a huge investment. And as a veterinarian, I can tell you in my experience that groups of weaned pigs that make it through the first about 6 weeks at less than 1.5% of mortality are very likely to be excellently performing groups. Now, we can only accomplish that early mortality goal if we get those weaned pigs successfully acclimatized to their new environment. And that includes getting them started on feed and water while providing an optimal environment. On today's webinar, we're blessed to have a couple of leading industry experts share their tips and experience for how to accomplish getting weaned pigs off to a great start. My sincere thanks goes out to today's speakers. The next couple of hours will be filled with tremendous insights from Dr. Steve Pollmann and Dr. Chris Deegan. I'm very excited to hear from them. For those in the audience, please feel free to participate with our group chat. You can interact with us via the chat. We're going to be monitoring that for your questions so we can direct them to our speakers during the Q&A section in the final part of the webinar. Let's go ahead and introduce our first speaker, Dr. Steve Pollmann. Dr. Pollmann is one of the bright minds in the global swine industry. Dr. Pollmann has worked in academia doing research, teaching, and extension. Dr. Pollmann retired in 2014, but still maintains a very active involvement in our industry. He started DSP Consulting, working with several clients with product development needs, pork production support, and team building. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Steve Pollmann.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a pleasure to be with you today. And as Clayton mentioned, we're talking about a topic that is frequently discussed, but one of the challenges I've had with this topic is how do we get something that really moves the needle on performance results? And so today, my intent is to share with you why it's important to get a good start, what are the industry trends and benchmark results, and then what do we need to do to improve the way pigs start by going upstream, and then some tips on improving monitoring, verifying key lead indicators, and then effective identification of problematic pigs, and then just share with you in closing some comments about wean to finish versus a nursery or 2-site versus 3-site production. I think we all recognize, and Clayton clearly stated, that when we get pigs off to a good start, we always see better closeout results. And generally that's driven by livability. And when we see better livability, that results in greater gains and improved feed efficiency. In addition to that, we tend to see less morbidity. And so our labor efficiency is improved. And then ultimately the real test is, do we see a greater percent of full value or grade A pigs? And my experience has been as well, we also, with that growth, we get heavier carcass weights, improving the leverage value of the start. And then that translates often into improved financial performance. And depending on systems, it could be up to about $4 a pig in the way of financial value. But oftentimes we have to ask ourselves, how do we define a good start? And I think the typical method used in our industry are pretty much the subjective indicators. And back when I was in the feed industry, we talked about bloom and body condition and what kind of diarrhea scores were we seeing, all those things that we would typically observe and monitor, but oftentimes we really didn't quantify. We just assessed, which is good in most cases. But to continue to take our start to the next level, I wanted to challenge the group a little bit by talking about a couple of additional methods to monitor, are we really getting a good start? And I'm going to call the first one quantification method. And one of the things in doing research and then working in production management at Smithfield for a number of years, it became very apparent that weight gain the first week post-weaning would help pigs get off to a better start. And so what I'm suggesting is that one looks at occasionally doing a random sample of weights of pigs. And to do that, you would individually tag and weigh about 100 pigs. And I suggest about 5 pigs from about 20 pens, just randomly selecting those. And then you determine the weight gain distribution and the mean. And what you're really trying to do is look to see, is 80% of those pigs gaining over 2 pounds the first week. And I think it surprises a lot of folks that many cases, their average may be no gain the first week. And if that's it, then one really needs to look at their system to quantify, what am I doing to get them off to a better start? The third method that I'd suggest to you is what I'm calling verification method. And we're going to talk today about using stretch targets. And really what I want to do is talk about the percent of closeouts meeting or exceeding these targets. And we'll talk through how you establish those targets and how you really know for sure. In many cases, what we see in the data is our mean is not necessarily indicative of the variation within the system. And maybe to start off, I think a presentation that Greg Brilby gave at the Lehman Conference a few years ago, talking about the profit factors and ranking of the 12 key components. And in this particular report, Greg commented that the number one factor influencing profitability is nursery finishing mortality. And obviously, percent market calls talks about grade A pigs and percent full value pigs. But interesting enough, those that did not hit the top 5 are the ones that we often talk about relative to feed efficiency, pigs per sow per year, and market weights. So the key message from this is, if we can improve finishing and nursery finishing livability, then many of our components are correlated and will come along with those. Now let's look at an industry trend that was reported from Meta Farms. And what they have done in this particular report is looked at the average mortality for wean to finish from 2012 to 2021. And you can see presently the average wean to finish mortality is 7.2%. And over this period of time, looking at the correlations down here, you can see we have a positive increase in mortality. And the R squares are relatively low, but suggesting that we're increasing mortality by about 1/10% per year. And notice the top 10%, or the worst 10%, is at 12.7, and the best 10% at 3.2, but they all have increases in mortality over this period of time, reinforcing to us that mortality is continuing to increase in our industry. Now, also, much due to the credit of MetaFarm, they provided us some great benchmark data that I'm pleased to be able to share with you. And the way this benchmark data is shown is in percentiles. And the red line would be the mean, and looking at mortality gain, adjusted feed efficiency, and then transfer weight. And in this case, the average mortality of 2.5 with a daily gain of 0.857 and a feed efficiency of 5.7. And typically when I've used this kind of benchmark data, I want to look at least the top 25 percentile. So if my goal was to be at the 90% percentile, this is where I'd be shooting for my targeted performance results. The same thing with finishing. The finishing mortality for 2019 is 3.8 with a 1.91 daily gain, which is a tremendous increase compared to what we saw a number of years ago. And then feed efficiency of 285. But notice this far column, the percent market sales, 94% of the pigs are really being classified as grade A pigs. And versus the 90% level, an extra little over 0.2 of a pound, and then another 3% on percent market sales. Then when you put the wean to finish benchmark data, the average there is a 5% mortality with a 167 daily gain, and the percent market's very similar. In fact, these tend to be just a bit higher than the others. But the intriguing thing to me, and I've seen over time, and we'll talk about this in more detail, when you take the 50 percentile benchmark for nursery and finishing and combine that, gives you 6.3 versus the wean to finish at 5.0. And so over the years of comparing these data sets, this is a consistent trend where wean to finish results will give you greater livability, and usually the daily gains and percent market sales will be greater with wean to finish systems. Now, another piece of data that MetaFarms was very kind to share with me, and I think really is an important part of getting pigs off to a good start, is minimizing variation. We've often talked about improvement is defined as reduced variation. And oftentimes when we use a mean, we really don't know the extent of the variation. In this particular slide, and a couple of slides to follow, is the distribution of the percent lots and the various closeouts. And I'll use the same breakout on the percent mortalities in each group. But notice the mean of 4.6 in this particular case. And so what really hurts us is this bottom 10%. So in this particular case, 10% of the closeouts have mortalities greater than 8%. And so we've got these catastrophic lots that add increased variability to our system. And those are the ones we've got to say, why are those happening and how effective are we identifying the causal factors of that? The same thing applies with the finishing mortality. In the same diagram, I should mention that this is talk about big data sets. 15,000 groups, 27 million pigs started showing these results. And you can see that in this case, there's about 11% of the pigs that have finishing mortality greater than 8%. And then when you take a look at the wean to finish lots, fewer lots, but still 13 million pigs looked at in this given case. And in this case, we've got 10% of them greater than 14% mortality. So I put these distribution curves in primarily to reinforce to us to say it probably needs to look at how many catastrophic lots or do we have really that are in kind of in that 2 standard deviations away from our mean. And those are some of our biggest problem areas. Now, another data set that I appreciate receiving is from AgriStats. AgriStats is a commercial service, and they have about 1.1 million sows in their system, or 17% of the industry, and they were kind enough to share the results from June to August with me. And I want to point out a couple of key messages here, and this is expressed as the average of those 1.1 million sows, and then the top 10, top 25%, and the bottom 10, and then the range between the top 10 and the bottom 10. And notice when we look at production costs, the average production cost in this particular period of time was $62, but amazingly, $16 difference between the top and the bottom. And you start to look at the drivers, you can clearly see it's a function of many of these, but it's interesting when you do the drill down of this data and you look at combined nursery finishing mortality, you see 9.2 difference between the top and the bottom with the average of 10, very similar to the MetaFarms results. But it's interesting to note that this particular column explains about 75% of this difference. And so far and away suggesting to us that if we can improve livability, we're going to see improvements in financial opportunities. Now, the way I've tried to use benchmark data in the past is I like to take external benchmark, as I've cited here with MetaFarms, and then internal benchmark, which would be the top 25 within my system, and then compare that to my company average, and then establish a 2-year stretch target, and then what is that annual change rate? And I'm going to focus primarily on the wean to finish. So in this case, we see the top 10, the company average of 1.7, but my internal benchmark is at 1.77, which clearly says in 25% of my operation, I'm hitting that number, and I've got methods in place to do that already. So if I could replicate those methods on my top 25 internally, that number will improve. So in this case, we're establishing a 2-year stretch target, suggesting that daily gain needs to improve at 0.03 pounds per day per year. Or mortality, and this is the one that I really want to focus on, is the company average of 5.8, top of 2.6, and the internal benchmark at 3.3. And so I established my 2-year stretch target at 3.5. That means I need to do a faster change with livability and change that at a rate of about 1% per year, which is that's a fast move. And the only way you're going to do that is to eliminate some of the catastrophic lots. Now, one of the challenges I've seen over the years in pork production, and it's very common in other business, is the concept of sub-optimization. And just to give a quick definition of that, sub-optimization optimization is specific techniques to determine the most cost-effective and efficient solution to a problem or design for a process. So in pork production, we have a lot of examples of where we sub-optimize. An example of that is decreasing weaning age in efforts to improve weaned pig throughput, resulting in decreased finishing livability and growth rate. The other one we see is excessive stocking of finishers, resulting in decreased growth rate. And then the other one that we see from a feed manufacturing standpoint is decreasing feed manufacturing costs by greater throughput, resulting in poorer pellet quality. So my feed cost goes down per ton, but the ability to use that feed efficiently is impaired. And oftentimes we see incentives that are aligned that create sub-optimization. And some of that today is the wall between sow farms and finishers. And we need to be able to tear that wall down and do a system optimization so the sow farm recognizes their part of the finishing performance responsibilities. And so I think the number one point that I'd like to reinforce to us today is upstream factors are so critical of getting pigs off to a good start. And the sow farm is the most critical component. And oftentimes it's overlooked, and there's very few research studies done on it, but in systems, you quickly start to be able to tease it out and do that evaluation. And it requires some fairly detailed analysis. An example from my past experience, we did some fairly extensive statistical modeling of this and using multiple step regression analysis. And in essence, what we found is that 52% of the closeout results is a function of the sow farm or flow. And it was 3 times greater than the next most important variable, including season, feed source, grower type, building type, all those kind of things. So far and away, the biggest single factor influencing pig performance is the pig flow. And historically, I've worked with both finishing and sow farms, and you ask the sow farm guys, how are your pigs doing downstream? And many of them just do not have systems in place where they know that. And in many cases, their incentive program is not intended for them to understand that. So we've got to continue to tear that wall down. Often I've told people when we look at pig performance coming out of the sow farm, we're only looking at score at halftime. And so we've got to get the whole game to capture how things are really working. An example of that comes from this particular analysis. There are 15 sow farms here, and the finishing mortality for each of those sow farms. And so this is a system that does single sourcing, and they're able to tease this out. And I recognize that's sometimes difficult to do, but this system averaged 4.8% finishing mortality. And notice in this case, they have 3 flows over here, 1 flow at 10% finishing mortality. But the real key point is there's 3 farms, which represented 20% of their sows, represented 33% of their finishing mortality. So in continuous quality improvement discussion, we would say these are the big legs of the Pareto. We've got to drill into these to say, how do we improve those real outliers? So what are some of the must-dos that occur for this upstream factor to get pigs off to a good start? And some of this, I think, is somewhat obvious, but commonly not done. The first one is to establish clear communication methods for sow farms to interact with the nurseries or wean to finish sites. And what I mean by that is they're routinely giving the health status or present concerns. And then I like to look at the results of the past 3 weaning groups. And we all know that a lot of times we see health problems at the nursery before we see them at the sow farm. And so by having this ongoing exchange between the sow farm and the finisher, and that needs to be not only when problems exist, but it's routine discussion. The next must do is you must have quality pig transfer standards. And I know this is a highly debated topic in our industry, but it's critical to say, how do I make sure I capture value and get a good start? And so I think the first thing is you've got to establish a transfer standard for birth weights. And in this case, I'm suggesting pigs less than 1.5 are not acceptable. And in some cases, people have moved that up to even almost up to 2 pounds now. And they're using methods where they might take a piece of PVC pipe and put it over the shoulders of the pig to see if it passes without doing the weighing. And quickly, what they're trying to detect are the peewees. And generally, that's as we continue to see larger litters, in many cases, we tend to see a few more peewees. And so that number might be as much as 1 to 2% of the pigs get euthanized at birth. And then at the same time, you've got to establish a weaning transfer standard. And assuming at least a 21-day weaning, I'm saying pigs have to weigh at least 7 pounds, and I'm saying no defects, excessive belly ruptures, lameness problems, things like that. Correct those before they go to the nursery. In many cases, I've seen situations where the rejected pigs going to the nursery might be as high as 1.5% because this transfer standard is not effectively implemented. The next part of upstream factor is to minimize weaning age variation. In all systems, if it's weekly weanings or if it's batch farrowings, you've got to continue to monitor what kind of weaning variation. And there's so much difference between a 23, 24-day-old pig versus an 18, 19-day-old pig. So using the thumb rule of plus or minus 2 days, and they've got to be in that range. And then I know we all recognize the importance of colostrum management, but we often think about that ending the first week of farrowing. But recent research has shown that if we get colostrum into the pig, there are lifetime benefits resulting in greater livability and greater growth rate when colostrum management is effectively done. So it's an upstream thing that sometimes is fairly laborious and difficult to get done, but we got to recognize we're playing in that first half to prepare better for the second half. And then at the same time, as litter sizes continue to increase and milk production uncertainty, we know that we've got to do a better job with creep feeding and water treatment in the farrowing crates to improve the sow's ability to lactate. And then the next point, and it's really about correcting the flows, and consistent weekly wean pig throughput, in my mind, is the most critical factor to be monitored at a sow farm. And here's an example of an SPC chart with weaned pigs per sow. And so in this case, we see the average of 12.2 with an upper and lower critical control chart. So you can see this process is pretty much in place, is current. Now let me show you an example of a sow farm that is excessive variation. So in this case, you've got up to say 1,000, 1,100 pigs over here, and in that same period, they're weaning 700 pigs. And that kind of inconsistency in throughput will kill downstream results because we tend to put them in or we double stock or whatever we do to try to minimize that. And we've got to go upstream to say, how do we get more consistent throughput? And here's an example of a consistent throughput, a little bigger sow farm, but you can see they're consistently weaning about 1,400 pigs. And that's the number of spaces that have been dedicated for that particular flow. And so with that jigsaw up and down, we're tending to wean pigs on a weekly basis into that, which causes some problems. Now, I wanted to do a quick timeout, and a quote that many of us are familiar with comes from Einstein, that insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. And I think relative to getting pigs off to a good start, we're guilty of that as an industry. We can tend to use our same methods. We don't adjust our methods, and we get the same results, and we expect improvement in results. And so one of the things that I wanted to challenge you a little bit is this particular version of inspect what you expect. And in this case, using the McDonald's Big Mac advertisement, here's what it looks like when they advertise it, here's what it's delivered to you. And think about what that means in the way we manage pigs. Here's what our SOPs think we're doing, but here's the results. And that's why we got to verify what are we doing. And to do that, I'd suggest that we really need to recognize that the bigger the systems get, there's more need. And as we get employees that are less experienced with pigmanship, we've got to trust but verify. And what I'm talking about is using lead indicators to improve lag indicators. The lag indicators are the closeout results, and what can we do upstream in that to monitor lead indicators? And wanted to share with you some, I think, absolute must-dos to get pigs off to a good start. Number one is the barn setup. Is the barn ready for the pigs based upon your procedures? The temperature in place, the feed in place, the water in place, and what percent of those lots are non-compliant? You ought to be able to know that number. And the environmental things are obvious and lots of systems in place trying to monitor that. But what we really want to know is how many out of compliance events and duration of those events for temperature and variation. And those need to say, how do I monitor those? When I get these things right, my results get better. The other thing that's interesting is the inventory. Something as simple as inventory. Is it accurate? Am I getting daily mortalities recorded? Is the stocking density effectively done? Do I have pen utilization and excessive stocking in one and understocking in others? And then the whole feed aspect to know, am I getting outages, and do I really effectively get my feeding program implemented correctly, especially with my phase 1, phase 2 diet amounts? And I'll tell you from my experience as a nutritionist, generally the nutrition problems are not formulate or product based. It's about feeding management is where the variation exists. So if I'm thinking I'm getting 3 or 4 pounds of that first phase diet, I'm getting 1 pound in, that's adding to the performance results challenges. And then the ongoing challenges with water, and I'll show you some results in that in just a minute, but the functionality, is the system functioning? Do I have plugged waters? Do I have dirty cups? And then how am I monitoring water usage? And then relative to treatments, what are the treatments being given and how many are being given and how much water is being given? And it's often, you hear veterinarians often say, I had this catastrophic lot that I had no idea that this had happened until I saw the closeout results. When you see that, that's much too late. So kind of the takeaway of all this is we've got to collect these lead indicators, and it sounds complicated, and more automation is starting to come. And over time, I would anticipate we will see some sort of index that captures these lead indicators that would point us in the direction to say, are things on automatic, and put that into some digital cockpit. One area I wanted to share with you is some recent work that we've done looking at the relationship of daily feed intake to water disappearance. And this particular system has the ability to monitor the amount of feed offered per day. And I've seen a lot of data attempting to do this same correlation, and most correlations are closer to 0.2, 0.3, where it says, I just don't have a lot of confidence that water will do that. But as we've improved the ability to collect the data on water as well as feed, we're now seeing an R-square of 0.89, which says 89% of variation in feed consumption is a function of water, which clearly I think is an important aspect for us to keep in mind. Intuitively, we've anticipated that, but we've never really been able to tease that out with empirical data. And the other critical information from this particular evaluation is over time, we consistently see an average ratio of water to feed of 2.5. So if we can increase water consumption, there's an 89% probability that will increase feed consumption. So water consumption does drive feed consumption, which we know will give us heavier weights out. One additional area that I want to talk about, but not in a lot of detail, is a number of years ago, Zoetis initiated an individual pig care program where they did a very good job of laying out some suggested management procedures to identify acute, subacute, and chronic illness pigs, where they called them A, B, and C pigs. And you can find that at these particular sites. And more recently, the Iowa Pork Group put together an excellent video. The citation is here. You can go in and look at that. And I know this concept has been around, but it has not been embraced dramatically. And it's really about quantification, verification of that you assume. Now, the last item that I wanted to address is really about wean to finish. And this debate has been ongoing for at least the last 3 decades in the swine industry. And initially, I was pretty skeptical that wean to finish would improve things until we did a series of evaluations and continue to evaluate the results of this. So I'm calling wean to finish 2-site benefits over 3-site, where the 3-site would be the nursery finisher. And what I've seen over the past few years, improved performance with wean to finish at the rate of 1 to 1.5% on livability, 2 to 4% on growth, and there's less disruption, less social order problems. And with that, probably, Clayton, is probably less disease mingling. And as pigs get mixed, we know they often go to the lowest level of performance of the group. And in our case, we were moving weaned pigs from great distances, or feeder pigs from great distances, because the nurseries were far away. And, you know, when we did the payback, it was as simple as saying, if we take 1 truckload of weaned pigs versus 3 truckloads of feeder pigs, you could do the payback on wean to finish. So the takeaway of this is that I think you can consistently see that wean to finish will give you a $2 to $3 advantage over 3-site production. And obviously with wean to finish, things are going to be more challenging than in the nursery because the environments are not quite as precise, and you got to have some things right. And my experience has been, is if I'm putting a bunch of young pigs in there, I'm going to have a lot of problems. And so I suggest a 23 to 25-day-old pig with an average start weight of at least 14 pounds, and that they be single sourced with short fills less than 1 week. And you can see in this picture, you got to have some extra excellent environmental conditions, especially the first 2 weeks, with brooders and bedding boards. And one of the challenges we've had in some situations is where the feeders are not designed quite right, or the waters for small pigs. An example of that might be somebody that has a liquid feeding system, and those are just not very conducive to starting new pigs. So in summary, number one, the industry wean to finish mortality is increasing and is highly variable. The mean doesn't really tell us all we need to know. We've got to work on improving information flow from the sow farm from the sow farm, and make sure we're thinking about system optimization and reward on system optimization. We need greater verification of key lead indicators, and a good start is more than just the first week's post-weaning. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pollmann. Would encourage everybody to add comments into the chat. We're going to do a group question and answer here at the end, but please add comments in from Dr. Pollmann's presentation, questions that you'd like us to address, and we'll certainly review those here after we get done with a presentation right now from the good Dr. Deegan. So let me go ahead and introduce Dr. Chris Deegan. Chris Deegan attended the University of Minnesota for undergraduate to study animal science and for veterinary education as well. Chris developed his interest in swine medicine and veterinary school after getting to work with a professor for a few years, and like many of us, was heavily influenced by a mentor, and that's why we're in the profession today. After veterinary school, Chris took a job as a swine veterinarian with Suiday Health and Production based out of their Morris, Minnesota clinic, where he still practices today. And I know, Chris, you get to work with the good Dr. Distad, who was a huge mentor for me early in my career as well. So with that, let me please join you in welcoming Dr. Deegan to the stage.
All right. Thank you, Clayton. Can you hear me all right?
Sound great.
Perfect. All right. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the trial we ran on the Tonisity PXW product on maternal line pigs, high health pigs. And so you can see the title of my presentation is it improves piglet nursery performance in a high health nursery scenario. So like Dr. Pollmann did such a good job going into depth on is how do we get pigs started right. And in a 30,000 foot view of it, I think there's kind of three things. You need to have a healthy pig on arrival. If you can get them started in a clean, dry, and warm environment, and then the sooner we can get them started on feed and drinking water, the better their performance is going to be. So the third point is really the reason we ran this trial, the Tonisity PXW. Tonisity advertise it as a palatable formula that attracts pigs to the water post-weaning and provides nutritional support. And the difference between Tonisity PXW and their other product PX is that this product can be ran through a water medicator, and it has a 3-day and a 5-day post-weaning tapered concentration. Both of the protocols have them tapered off so that the pigs, if you take them out right away, they can just go off water because they like the product so much. So again, rationale for the study we ran is to demonstrate the effects of the PXW on high health, which in this scenario is no PERS, no PED, and no mycoplasma pneumoniae pigs post-weaning. This is important because, pure maternal lines or even F1 cross maternal lines, it's no secret they may start a little harder than the terminally crossed pig. And so there is some potential there to be able to increase their performance in these GDUs and grow outs by being able to get them started on feed and water a little better. Also demonstrating that even in high health herds, the PXW can make a difference to help improve the bottom end of your pigs. So even though we don't have PERS, PD, mycoplasma, that kind of stuff, it doesn't mean we don't have the other bugs, the streps, the parasuis, E. coli, etc. And so there is some opportunity there to get the pigs off to a healthier start. And then in this trial, we also compared the PXW product to another commercially available electrolyte supplement. So the study had 8 wean groups of pigs, and we had over 5,600 pigs in this study. The pigs were all gilts, TN70 gilts, and they had approximately a 4-hour drive from the sow farm to the nursery grow out site. And the average wean age is about 20 days coming out of that sow farm. As like I stated earlier, the gilts were all PERS, PD, myco negative, and flu negative as well. The gilt developer itself was tested weekly with oral fluids for PERS, PD, and myco. And we took monthly blood serum for PERS, myco ELISAs, and PERS PCR. The sow farm they were coming from was tested monthly with piglet serum for PERS PCR and processing fluids for PERS PCR and PCB2 and 3 stability as well. The study we completed was done between December of 2020 and July of 2021. So this would be the treatment protocol that we had in place. We did the 5-day protocol post-weaning, where we, you can see the Tonisity PXW had the tapered administration versus the electrolyte we tested against had just a solid 0.2% all the way through. The barn where the trial was run, it actually is a wean to finish site, but he runs a couple of the rooms as just the nurseries and then moves them out. So the nursery rooms each have 20 pens, and there's approximately 35 pigs to a pen. Each wean group would fill one of the rooms, and pigs were randomly placed to either the north side of the room or the south side of the room, and that's how they were placed into their trial groups. And one half of the room was one treatment group, and one half of the room was the other group. The room had water meters set up and water medicators set up for each side of the room, so we can monitor water levels for each treatment group separately, as well as have separate medication given to them or treatments. And then the skilled developer also had an on-site scale that was able to collect pen weights. So we were weighing about 35 to 40 pigs at a time on these scales, and then dividing it by the number of pigs in that pen to get the average pen weight. For the data we collected out of this study, we were monitoring water intake per treatment for each batch, and that was a daily water intake we monitored. We were taking pen weights at 3 different time points. We took them as the pigs. So we ran the pigs off the trailer, got them sorted into their pens, and then that same day we once the pens were established, we ran them to the scale and took a weaning weight average, a day 14 post-weaning average, and a day 42 post-weaning average. We also monitored how many fall behind pigs, basically how many pigs did they pull into the hospital pens and how many were treated, as well as kept track of all the mortalities for each group. So the results of the study, we had an extra 300 grams of ending nursery weight added. The beginning weight differential was only about 0.04 pounds different, 4/100ths of a pound difference. And at the end of the trial, the Tonisity pigs did have a 0.65 pound advantage over. So there was some gain there. This is probably one of the cooler graphs they have. There was a 22% higher water intake on day 1 post-weaning. And kind of like Dr. Pollmann talked about in his presentation before mine, getting pigs hydrated again after a potentially long trailer ride is very important, but also the correlation between water intake and feed intake is being established. So having higher water intake would, assuming that we would have higher feed intake as well and a quicker start for our pigs. And then we looked at mortalities and fall behinds, and there was a 17% decrease in mortality and a 65% decrease in fall behinds. And these pigs are high health and their performance is still really good. But even with that, the Tonisity product did help us save some pigs and save pigs from being pulled, which would help in medication costs and all that stuff as well, and labor. So just to summarize, out of this trial, we did find additional ending nursery weight gains at about 300 grams on average per pig. There was a 22% higher water intake on day 1 post-weaning, with a 9% higher water intake averaged, 9% higher water intake over the 5-day post-weaning period. And there were 65% fewer fall behinds and 17% fewer mortalities out of that nursery turn. And the Tonisity PXW 5-day post-weaning protocol has far-reaching nursery benefits, even for high health pigs. So some further questions we had out of this study, since they are gilts, for the most part, we want most of them to go as breeding stock and not as market pigs. But the two questions I would have liked to chase a little further would have been, did this product help accelerate days to market for the pigs that weren't selected as gilts due to percentage of gilt sales or non-select or whatever? Did they reach market weight quicker? And then, putting the number of gilt sales aside, could we have selected, if we had, 100% of gilt sold, hypothetically, would there have been more gilts we could have selected out of the PXW group versus the other? And looking at fall behinds and mortalities, that is a potential, which can help you have, more returns in that sense too. But yeah, so there's some further things we could do at this trial, but there is some very interesting information we got from it. So yeah, that's the trial we ran. And if there's any questions, you can ask them here or email me.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dr. Deegan. We're ready to transition now into our live Q&A session. So Laura, if you could bring the good Dr. Pollmann on, we'll have a nice little chat here, and we'll certainly start with some of the questions from the audience. And still time to get your questions in, so please click on the comments. Thank you to everybody who has done that. Please, if you haven't, go ahead and throw your questions on there. One of the first questions we got, Dr. Pollmann, during your presentation was about the percentage of wean to finish losses difference between the lots. How much of that, Dr. Pollmann, can we simply explain by a single disease challenge being PRRS positive pigs versus PRRS negative pigs?
Well, Clayton, it's hard for me to know for sure. We know that when we talk about sow, farm, and flow, that's confounded with disease, right? And all of those are going to be moving targets. We know the worse the health status is, the worse the downstream performance is going to be. Yeah. But what's interesting about that to me is that you have systems that all believe they have this common health status across their sow farms, and they're characterizing them. And they may even call this flow PRRS stable, but something's going wrong. But I'd appreciate your comments, Clayton, from your standpoint, because you've seen this a lot as well.
Yeah. I'd say, Dr. Pollmann, the first thing I'd say is we are too subjective in our description of a PRRS positive flow. Mm-hmm. You said it when you talked about the wean pig startup, right? We're too subjective in how we describe how it's going. It's kind of good, it's kind of bad. The pigs are fleshy, they're not fleshy, right? What can you do with that? If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Right. And so that's step number one with PRRS is we've got to quantify that. We can't just say PRRS stable, because the definition of that is different to me than it is to Dr. Deegan, than it is to yourself, right? But one thing I can tell you is your finishing flows can be absolutely hammered by PRRS virus, even without clinical signs at your sow farm. I visit with producers all the time, and they say, but my sow farm is healthy, right? Like, look, my performance metrics are good. My PSY is fine, and there's no clinical signs at my sow farm. And we go look at those finishing pigs, and in the nursery, they are sick as can be. And is there parasuis and strep and other things there? Absolutely. But what's the root cause? The root cause is they've got tremendous levels of PRRS virus that's taken over their immune system. So,
and are they able to go upstream, Clayton, in that situation and quantify what that sow farm is doing across more than just that one particular lot?
I think you can. I think with today's diagnostics, we can do that either with individual pig samples, like bleeding pigs at weaning, which we've known how to do for years, and even with population level samples like processing fluids, family oral fluids. We've got the ability to go into that sow farm and say, okay, where are we leaking, right? Maybe it's an LVI program in the GDU that's causing a big problem, right? Maybe it's just circulation in the farrowing house. But we've got the diagnostic available opportunities to do that. It's easier said than done, as you know, especially when the pigs are changing hands in a financial transaction. It's truly weaned pigs that are sold from one person to another. But in an integrated production system, you've got to be able to work together on that very quickly to say, where is that PRRS coming from, right? And if we're calling it stable and it's still leaking wild type virus, from my perspective, that's not stable. All right, next question we've got, Chris, is for you. Have you seen any data or collected any data that compares the Tonisity product to just water alone? We looked at it versus an electrolyte solution, but what about just Tonisity versus nothing at all?
I personally haven't seen any data with comparing it to nothing at all in the water, just plain water. The reason we didn't do that in this trial is that we kind of wanted to keep it without changing much. Before we ran the trial, the gilts we were starting were being started on this electrolyte B, they're calling it in the trial. And so really we wanted to see hey, is there a product we could switch from this to that to even make further improvements on them? And we didn't want to pull everything out of there just because, having maternal lines, they may have an additional premium on top of them. So we want to keep them as healthy and keep as many potential selects out of there. So we didn't pull the other product.
And Chris, it's really, you mentioned it, but to me, it's really intriguing that you got improvement in excellent performance results.
Yeah.
And so if you had average or bad results, what would the effect be? And
I think that would be
the scale of your test
information.
was impressive too.
Yeah. I think that would be good information to see as well. Is even in high health pigs, they're performing better with this product. If you have PRRS weaning or pigs with PRRS at weaning, would these results be amplified even further? And that would be interesting data to receive as well.
And theoretically, you sure would expect that, wouldn't you, Clayton? I mean, if you have more problems, the solution ought to be better.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And I think, a couple of things within the high health category, a lot of those high health pigs are maternal barrow byproduct pigs, right? They are pigs that don't quite have as much thrive to go hit the feeder and hit the water cup right when they're weaned. So I think for those pigs, it's a no-brainer to look at products like this. And for sure, within your health challenge pigs, whether they are commercial pigs or maternal barrows, right there's going to be huge opportunities there to help make sure that those pigs are getting off to a better start with these products. I think it's pretty easy to extrapolate the results to those health challenge situations.
And I think if you weigh some of those pigs and know what that is and move from just, they look different.
Yeah, I was going to ask you on the weigh-in pigs, Dr. Pollmann, you mentioned that as a way to evaluate that startup. So weigh pigs at day 0 and then at the end of the week. So if a producer wants to do that, if you're going to weigh 100 of them, does that have to be the same pigs every time?
Yeah.
Does the producer?
You want to weigh the same pigs every time. That's why you want to tag them, Clayton.
Yep.
And so what you're trying to do is, and then you're trying to take a random sample out of the pen too. And so that way you're getting, some big ones, some small ones, some little ones. And, it's a lot of work, but I've done it at a number of sites, and most people that walk away from it are surprised what percent of the pigs are not gaining any weight, let alone hitting 2 pounds.
It's a lot of work, but we've got to move towards those leading indicators, right? And we don't have many of those. So there's going to be work involved with capturing that data. If it was easy to get, we'd be capturing it already.
Well, frankly, it's kind of a fun project. I'd call it a continuous improvement activity for the farm group to say, how are our pigs really doing?
Yep.
And now you have a standard. You can say, how's that distribution look? And then you can impose different treatments and see if we're getting a greater frequency of heavier pigs. Mm-hmm. And then that's when you see the harvest come, because when you get that first 2-week start, then you're going to see the benefits on the closeouts.
Yep. Chris, I'm going to try and combine a couple of our audience questions here for you that I think are relevant. Mike Funk asked, did you take a water sample in the trial for analysis? We know that there's high variability in the water quality and what's in the water at the different sites that we have. And then Jordan Waldner asked, would increasing the water intake with tools like pH control or sanitation not have the same effects? So is that something, Chris, you think that producers, veterinarians, and nutritionists should do as a starting point, is take a water sample and see what you're dealing with and then try and customize the solution to that situation? Or do you think that we are better off just letting the pigs tell us what works and, try a product that you like and then look at the water intake on the back end and see if it's helping, yes or no?
Yeah. No, so the site we ran this trial at, it was on a rural water supply, which will probably have better than if it was well or something like that. As far as comparing it to, just some more simple products that maybe will drop the pH or, clean up any potential coliforms in the water, I think that's just potential for further trials where we can, really run this product and prove that it does more than adding citric acid to the water or adding bleach to the water, just with the additional nutrients and stuff in that, as well as the flavoring agents that help bring the pigs to the water as well.
Very good. Dr. Pollmann, I was going to ask you here for your thoughts about where do we go with incentive programs to try and help the production system make the best decision? I thought you highlighted very well that the sow farm is a huge contributor to post-weaning performance. It controls a massive amount of it, okay? Yet we still typically have incentive programs in our industry that are heavily focused on the number of pigs our sow farms produce. Have you got thoughts about what the next generation of incentive programs look like to try and bridge that gap, to try and help us incentivize the right things, not sub-optimize things, optimize profit, right? And we know that that's heavily correlated with that finishing mortality, which is heavily correlated with what happens from ovulation until weaning. Any thoughts on that?
Well, Clayton, I've battled with that question for 20 years, frankly. The thing I recognize is our present systems are not working very well. When we only incentivize the sow farms, they're getting bonuses and the finishing guys are not getting anything. And so that is demoralizing to teamwork. And so it needs to be a measurement that we create the win for all parties. And my experience with that has been is to try to move away from the segment incentives to system incentives. And that might be relative to one's stretch target or budget. And then we used a program we called gain share. So we paid based upon how we improved over what we anticipated. And all parties qualified for that to a certain degree. And so, the old saying about incentives, be careful what you ask people to do because they'll probably do it based upon the money. And I think the way we've incentivized sow performance is a very classic example of sub-optimization.
I couldn't agree with you more, Dr. Pollmann. One of my best friends growing up, Jason Buss, is I couldn't tell you his title today with the mash offs, but we grew up together literally. We graduated from high school together, and Jason worked his way up through the mash off system and is one of their, if he's not a production director, I mean, he's right up there. He's an excellent guy, a great pig man. And he understood the bonus program for the sow farms he managed better than anybody I have ever met. And I used to always say, if we're going to have an incentive program, go ask Jason what he's going to do. Just that, right? If we get a draft of an idea, just go ask Jason how it's going to change his behavior. And then we'll understand if that's the behavior that we wanted to change, right? But I think you're on to it. We've got to have at least some of the bonus program be incentivized by the system level numbers. And at the end of the day, the pig industry is a business. And when businesses are profitable, business is good, right? So the more we can tie it to financial performance of the system, I think the better. Chris, any comments from you on metric opportunities or incentive opportunities that you think help chase the right behaviors?
I would agree. I mean, having it as a whole system, it not only helps when we're, it's not a secret that the industry is kind of going through some labor issues, and it's hard to find people to help out. And if you have a whole system wide and you have one part of your system that maybe has some more labor than an area that's struggling more, if we can incentivize the system wide, it may incentivize people to go help out some of those understaffed areas as well. So I definitely agree with what you said right there.
Clayton, I might add a real quick personal experience. I remember making a visit to a large sow farm in Oklahoma a number of years ago. One of the best sow performance managers I've ever known and worked with. And as we were walking through the barn, I said, "How are your pigs doing downstream?" And he looked at me with a puzzled look on his face and he says, "I have no idea." And this guy could have told me everything about his pigs at the sow farm. And then I had to ask myself, I have failed this guy because I have not helped him understand downstream performance effects. And so that was a real epiphany for me to go back and say, we've got to get better information to this upstream if we want them to own the downstream results.
Very, very well said, right?
And the systems don't allow that, right?
You can't make change until there's awareness. And if there's no awareness of the opportunity, you're never going to get it right. Many examples we could talk about, right? Of the finishing team says, "Hey, the pigs are doing this post-weaning." And the sow farm says, "Well, they don't do that here." And as the veterinarian, you get to see both sides. You just smile and nod. You're like, you're both right. You're 100% right. Yeah. All right. We could keep this chat going on probably until 12 p.m., not 12 a.m. And we may do that offline, but we probably owe it to our sponsors and to the Swine team to wrap it up here. So I'll give some closing comments here, and we'll let everybody go. First and foremost, I want to thank our speakers, Dr. Chris Deegan, Dr. Steve Pollmann. It's my pleasure to get to interact with you on this and any other times we get to interact together. Wonderful information. Thank you very much for bringing it. When I think about take-homes from Chris and Steve's messages, remember, you can't manage what you don't measure, right? And our measurements of weaned pig quality, weaned pig startups are too subjective. We have to move past that. I'm not saying that's easy. I'm not saying that won't be without resources being deployed. I'm saying that's the opportunity we need to chase, because the few objective measurements we have today of weaned pig performance are lagging. And my good friend, Dr. Scott Stellick, would call it dead fish management, right? The problem has already happened. There's nothing we can do there. We probably overvalue some of our favorite back of the baseball card metrics in the pig industry, particularly PSY. It simply doesn't correlate with system level profitability as well as your mortality does. I think Dr. Pollmann did a great job of showing us good data on water intake and its huge predictive capabilities toward feed intake. All right. And we know feed intake is a leading indicator of that weaned pig group performance. So there's an opportunity in there. We heard from Dr. Deegan about products that can help, right? We saw a statistically significant increase with the Tonisity PXW product for not only an increase in water intake, but also an associated decrease in fallouts when we use that product relative to traditional electrolytes. And that's even true in high health flows. So with that, I thank you very much for helping to be a part of this webinar. I hope you found it enjoyable. Thank you very much to the folks that were active in the chat box and shared your comments and questions. Our industry is pretty small. So if you got more questions, you can probably find Drs. Deegan and Pollmann and myself on LinkedIn or some other way to connect with us if you have additional questions. Before we conclude, I do want to thank everyone. Most importantly, again, our speakers, Dr. Deegan and Dr. Pollmann, but also thank you very much to the Tonisity team and the Swine team for helping to organize this high quality event and allowing us to be a part of it. For Dr. Pollmann and Dr. Deegan, thank you very much and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all. Take care. Bye-bye.